Stand at the edge of the Patapsco River on a gray Maryland morning and look southeast toward the wide, flat neck of land where the river empties into the Chesapeake Bay, and you will see what remains of something that once helped save the world. The peninsula is called Sparrows Point, and today it goes by a different name entirely: Trade Point Atlantic. 3,300 acres of logistics infrastructure, deep-water berths, rail connections, distribution warehouses stretching to the horizon. Amazon fulfillment centers sit where dry docks once held destroyers. Container cranes rise over a waterfront that once bristled with slipways and rivet guns and the smell of hot steel and salt air. If you walk the right sections of the property, past the fencing and the loading areas and the rows of parked commercial vehicles, you can still find remnants of what was here before. The ghost of a slipway, a rusted chain half buried in fill, a concrete foundation pad that once held something enormous, some piece of machinery whose purpose you cannot now determine and would not believe if someone told you. What was here before was the Bethlehem Steel Sparrows Point Shipyard, and it ran for over 100 years, from 1889 to 1997. At its peak, it employed 33,000 workers on the waterfront alone, with another 4,000 in the adjacent steel mill that stretched 5 square miles behind it. During World War II, Bethlehem Steel's 15 shipyards spread across this country produced more than 1,100 ships, nearly one-fifth of the entire United States two-ocean fleet. The destroyers that swept the Atlantic clear of German submarines, the aircraft carriers that turned the tide in the Pacific, the Liberty ships that kept Britain alive when nothing else could reach her shores. The company behind all of it, Bethlehem Steel Corporation, was the second largest steel maker in the world and the largest shipbuilder in American history. It built the Golden Gate Bridge and the George Washington Bridge and the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building. It forged the armor that protected the Navy and the structural beams that held up the skyline of every major American city for 100 years. It employed 300,000 people at its wartime peak and paid wages that allowed those workers to buy homes, raise families, and send their children to college. And then, in a collapse that took 50 years to complete, it lost everything: the workers, the plants, the pensions, the contracts, the name itself. This is the story of how that happened. It is the story of Charles Schwab, the gambler from a Pennsylvania livery stable who built one of the most powerful industrial empires in history and died $300,000 in debt. It is the story of Eugene Grace, the crane operator who turned down a baseball contract from the Boston Braves and ended up running the most important defense company in American history, and who, in the years of greatest prosperity, made decisions that guaranteed the company's eventual ruin. And it is the story of steel itself and what it reveals about the nature of industrial power, how quickly it rises, how long the decline takes, and what gets left behind when it is finally gone. Before we go further, drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from tonight. If you are from Maryland, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, or any of the communities that built their identity around steel and shipbuilding, we especially want to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed yet, please take a moment to do that now. It helps us keep making documentaries like this one, and it means we can keep telling the stories that deserve to be told. Now, to understand how a shipyard in Maryland came to build the destroyers and aircraft carriers that shaped the 20th century, we have to begin in Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley, where the first ironworks that would eventually become Bethlehem Steel were lit on a January morning in 1863. The company had been organized 6 years earlier, in April of 1857, under the name Saucona Iron Company, by a group of railroad investors and businessmen in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, who had studied the region's geography and concluded it was exactly what an iron operation required. The Lehigh Valley sat at the intersection of resources. Anthracite coal came from the mines of eastern Pennsylvania by rail. Iron ore arrived from deposits scattered across the region. The Lehigh River provided water and a transportation corridor that connected the valley to broader markets. The area had a skilled industrial workforce already shaped by decades of metalwork and mining, and the kind of practical mechanical ingenuity that comes from working with heavy materials in close quarters for generations. the Panic of 1857, a national financial crisis that struck just months after the company's organization, temporarily halted development before the first furnace could be completed. But the investors pushed forward, reorganized, changed the name to the Bethlehem Iron Company, and resumed construction. The first blast furnace lit on January 4, 1863, and immediately began producing railroad rails for a country in the middle of laying tracks from coast to coast. For the first 20 years, the company did exactly this, making rails, supplying the railroad expansion that was reshaping American commerce. It was honest industrial work, and it generated consistent revenue. But it was not yet the thing that would make Bethlehem the most consequential industrial operation in American history. That transformation came from an unexpected direction. In the early 1880s, the United States government decided it was time to rebuild the Navy. The fleet that had won the Civil War was aging and obsolete. Congress appropriated funds for a new generation of steel-hulled, steam-powered warships, and the Navy went looking for American companies capable of forging the armor plate and large-caliber gun barrels that modern warships required. There were very few such companies. The equipment needed to work steel at that scale, to hammer a 12-inch gun barrel from a single massive forging, or to roll armor plate thick enough to stop a projectile, did not yet exist in America in any meaningful capacity. Bethlehem saw the opportunity and built the capacity to fill it. In June of 1887, Bethlehem Iron signed contracts to provide the forging and armor for two second-class battleships, the USS Texas and the USS Maine, the ships that would become famous in the Spanish-American War a decade later. To fulfill those contracts, the company built what was described at the time as the first heavy forging plant in the United States, a facility equipped with hydraulic presses and forge hammers of a scale that had never been installed in an American industrial operation. The investment required to build that capacity was enormous. What it purchased was not just the ability to make gun barrels and armor for those two ships. It was a mastery of working very large pieces of steel under extreme pressure, the foundational capability that would define everything Bethlehem became in the century that followed. Other remarkable things emerged from those Bethlehem shops during this period. Frederick Taylor, the man who would later become famous as the founder of scientific management, conducted some of his most important experiments in the Bethlehem Heavy Gun Shop during his years there in the late 1890s. He developed his landmark high-speed tool steel, a material that could hold a cutting edge at temperatures where ordinary steel softened, and which transformed metalworking operations across the industry. The Bethlehem Forge also hammered the 70-ton steel axle for height. George Ferris's great rotating wheel at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, one of the engineering spectacles of the age. The lock gates of the Panama Canal, each one weighing hundreds of tons and required to withstand the enormous hydraulic pressures of the canal locks, came from Bethlehem. These were not side projects. They were demonstrations repeated across 2 decades that a steel company in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania had become one of the most technically sophisticated industrial operations anywhere on Earth. In 1899, as the century turned, the company reorganized under the name Bethlehem Steel Company. It was still a Pennsylvania institution, still oriented toward naval contracts and heavy industrial forgings, still managed by men who had spent their careers in the valley. The Bethlehem plant now stretched along the south bank of the Lehigh River, its blast furnaces and forges and rolling mills filling a landscape that had been farmland. Within living memory, the community around it had grown to accommodate the workforce, row houses and churches and company-owned stores and schools, an entire ecosystem of daily life built around the rhythms of the plant. When the furnaces ran full, the valley prospered. When they slowed, the whole community felt it. That was the company that Charles Schwab arrived to transform. Charles Michael Schwab was born on February 18, 1862, in a small Pennsylvania town called Williamsburg, the son of a man who ran a livery stable and delivered the mail. His family was not wealthy. His father John moved the family to Loretto, Pennsylvania, where Charles grew up in a household that was Catholic, working class and largely immigrant in its recent origins. All 4 of his grandparents had come from Germany. He graduated from St. Francis College in Loretto in 1877 and was not yet 16 years old. He found work at Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel, Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, starting as a stake driver in the engineering corps, one of the lowest entry positions available in the operation. What Schwab possessed in place of connections or capital was something rarer and more useful, an ability to understand people with an almost instinctive precision. He knew how to make men feel valued. He knew how to read the motivations behind what people said and what they did not say. He knew how to place the right person in the right role and then make them want to exceed what they thought was possible. Carnegie noticed this quality almost immediately. He began giving Schwab more responsibility, watching how he handled it, and then giving him more. By the time Schwab was 35 years old, he was president of Carnegie Steel, which was the largest steel company in the world. Thomas Edison once called him the master hustler, which in that era carried none of the negative connotation the phrase has since acquired. What Edison meant was that Schwab possessed the full spectrum capacity of the great industrial promoters of the Gilded Age, the ability to see the whole dimensions of a situation simultaneously, the technical realities, the human dynamics, and the financial possibilities, and to move faster than anyone around him to capitalize on what he saw. Carnegie valued Schwab not merely as an operations manager, but as a living argument for the entire future of steel. It was Schwab who gave the famous dinner speech at the University Club of New York in December of 1900 that convinced J.P. Morgan to fund the consolidation of the American steel industry. The speech ran 3 hours. When it was over, Morgan agreed to create what became United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in American history. Schwab became its first president. He was 39 years old. He lasted 2 years before the structural conflicts between his operating instincts and the board's financial conservatism became untenable. Morgan was a banker who thought in terms of stability and dividend maintenance. Schwab was a builder who thought in terms of expansion and market dominance. They could not coexist indefinitely in the same corporate structure, and they did not. In 1903, Schwab resigned. He had already made his next move. In 1901, while still at U.S. Steel, he had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the Bethlehem Steel Company, a transaction that later attracted significant scrutiny and legal challenge. After a complicated sequence of events involving a failed shipbuilding trust called the United States Shipbuilding Company, which went bankrupt, taking several associated companies down with it, Schwab emerged in control of Bethlehem Steel's core assets. On December 10, 1904, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation was formally incorporated in New Jersey, with Schwab as president and chairman of the board. A company that had begun as a railroad rail supplier in the Lehigh Valley was about to become something its founders could never have imagined. While all of this was unfolding, Schwab was building himself a house. He purchased the entire block on Riverside Drive in Manhattan in 1901, from West End Avenue to the Hudson River, between 73rd and 74th Streets, paying $865,000 for the land. It was the highest price ever paid for a building lot in New York City at that time. He commissioned a French architect named Maurice Hébert to design a Loire Valley chateau inspired by the great houses of Chenonceau, Blois, and Azay-le-Rideau. Construction ran from 1902 to 1906. When the mansion was finished, it contained 75 rooms spread across 50,000 square feet, 4 stories of limestone rising from lawns that stretched to the river. The interior ran to bowling alleys and an indoor pool set beneath a glass dome, a full gymnasium, a private chapel, and a pipe organ that Schwab later expanded twice. His private organist, a man named S. Archer Gibson, earned $10,000 per year, a sum that exceeded the annual wages of many of the steelworkers who made Schwab's fortune possible. The building generated its own electricity, filtered its own water, and maintained coal storage sufficient for extended independent operation. When Andrew Carnegie, whose own Fifth Avenue mansion would eventually house the Cooper Hewitt Museum, saw what Schwab had built on Riverside Drive, he reportedly said it made his own home look like a shack. Schwab was not building that house to impress Carnegie. He was building it because it expressed something central about who he was, a man from a Pennsylvania livery stable who had decided there was no point in possessing the resources of an empire and living without demonstrating it. He played poker for high stakes and gambled at Monte Carlo. He entertained in the manner of heads of state. He owned a 1,000-acre country estate in Pennsylvania, and maintained a villa in France. A Lehigh University historian who spent years studying his life described him as a romantic and a visionary, and something of a speculator and a gambler, a man whose motives were not always rational, but whose instincts, when they worked, were extraordinary. One of those instincts was the hire he made almost immediately after taking control of Bethlehem Steel. A young man named Eugene Grace had come to the company straight from Lehigh University, where he had graduated as class valedictorian in 1899 and played shortstop on the baseball team with a .400 batting average. The Boston Braves had offered him a professional contract. He turned it down to work as a crane operator for Bethlehem Steel at $1.80 per day. Schwab sent him to Cuba to untangle problems at Bethlehem's iron mining operations there. Grace succeeded, returned, and began a climb through the organization that would eventually make him the most powerful figure in American steelmaking. This casual assignment of a promising young engineer to a difficult foreign posting was the decision on which the entire subsequent history of the company would turn. What Schwab understood more clearly than almost anyone in the American industrial world of 1904 was that the future belonged to ships. In 1905, he made the acquisition that began transforming that conviction into the largest shipbuilding enterprise the world had ever seen. The Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, had an origin that belongs as much to the history of communications technology as to the history of naval construction. It traced its founding to a farm alongside the Weymouth Fore River, purchased in 1882 by a man named Thomas A. Watson. Watson had spent years as the primary assistant to Alexander Graham Bell, working alongside him through the development of the telephone. Bell repaid this assistance with a 10% ownership stake in the Bell Telephone Company. When Watson eventually sold those shares, he was a man of considerable means. He bought the farm. He decided he wanted to build marine engines, founded the Fore River Engine Company, and set in motion a chain of events that no one involved could have anticipated. Consider what that sequence represents: the money that funded the construction of America's most productive wartime shipyard came, in a direct and traceable line, from the invention of the telephone. Thomas Watson, the man who heard Alexander Graham Bell say through the first working telephone that he needed his assistant's help, used the financial proceeds of that moment to build the yard that would, in 1942, 1943, and 1944, produce more warship tonnage than any other American facility. History rarely moves in lines this direct or this strange. Bethlehem acquired the Union Iron Works in San Francisco in 1905, establishing its formal shipbuilding division and giving it a presence on the West Coast. In 1913, Schwab purchased Fore River and moved Bethlehem's shipbuilding headquarters to Quincy. Shortly after the acquisition, a 28-year-old Irish-American named Joseph Kennedy began working at Fore River as an assistant general manager. While there, he met Franklin Roosevelt, then serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The connections that formed in that Quincy shipyard across those years would resonate for decades through American political life. Bethlehem acquired Maryland Steel's operations at Sparrows Point in 1916, absorbing both a steel mill and a shipyard that had been operating since 1889 on 200 acres of waterfront at the Patapsco River's junction with the Chesapeake Bay. The strategic advantage of this particular acquisition was unlike anything available at any other shipyard in America. The Sparrows Point steel mill sat directly adjacent to the slipways. Steel plate rolled out of the furnaces and went into ship hulls within days, with no transportation costs and no delivery delays. Most shipyards anywhere in the world had to source their steel from distant mills and manage complex supply chains to keep production flowing. At Sparrows Point, the supply chain was measured in yards rather than miles. The efficiency advantage was real and durable and compounding over time. By 1917, when the United States entered the First World War and Bethlehem incorporated its shipbuilding operations as the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation, the company controlled a network of facilities that stretched from Quincy to Baltimore to Staten Island, to Brooklyn to Hoboken to San Francisco and beyond. 15 yards would eventually form the full network, spread across both coasts and into Texas, representing a continental shipbuilding capacity that no other company in American history had assembled or has assembled since. One more thing about Fore River belongs in any honest account of what that yard produced. The most widely reproduced piece of graffiti in the history of the American military. The phrase "Kilroy was here," which soldiers and sailors carried with them to every theater of the Second World War, and which became the defining cultural signature of an entire generation at war, almost certainly originated in that Quincy shipyard. A man named James Kilroy worked at Fore River during the war years, counting rivet holes to verify the work of the riveters, so that their pay could be accurately calculated. To prevent dishonest workers from claiming holes they had not riveted, Kilroy began marking his inspections with his chalk signature. When the ships built at Fore River were deployed, sailors found Kilroy's marks chalked in the most remote and inaccessible corners of the vessels, spaces that seemed impossible for any human to have reached. The phrase developed its own mythology and traveled with American forces around the world. The joke that started as a fraud prevention measure on the slipways of a Massachusetts shipyard became the defining cultural artifact of the greatest conflict in human history. Before the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, Bethlehem Steel had already been engaged in it for nearly 3 years. From the outbreak of hostilities in the summer of 1914, Schwab worked to position Bethlehem as the primary supplier of war material to the Allied powers. Britain needed guns and armor plate and submarines and ships in quantities that its own industrial base could not supply fast enough. France and Russia needed munitions and ordnance. All of them needed these things from a country that was not yet at war and could ship goods freely across the Atlantic. Bethlehem, with its heavy forging capacity and its growing network of shipyards, was the American company best positioned to fill those orders. The profits that flowed from the Allied contracts during the neutrality period were enormous, and they funded the expansion and modernization of facilities that the company would need for the even greater demands that came when America entered the war. The most celebrated and legally complex of Schwab's wartime arrangements involved submarines. The British government needed undersea vessels with a speed that British yards, already overwhelmed with surface ship work, could not provide. The challenge for Bethlehem was that American neutrality laws prohibited the direct sale of weapons to belligerent nations. Schwab's solution was characteristically bold. The hull sections and components for the submarines would be manufactured in American facilities and shipped to a British-owned yard in Montreal, Canada, where the vessels would be assembled and launched under British flag. American authorities reviewed and approved the arrangement. All of the submarines were delivered on schedule and within the agreed cost. Winston Churchill, who was deeply involved in British naval procurement throughout this period, developed an admiration for Schwab that he maintained for the rest of his life. He regarded the man as one of the most capable industrial organizers he had ever encountered. At the Fore River Yard in Quincy, the wartime production numbers were staggering by any measure then available. In 1918 alone, the yard completed 18 destroyers, 10 submarines, and 6 merchant ships. Over the entire course of the war, Fore River produced 71 flush-deck destroyers, more than every other American shipyard combined. Among them was the USS Reed, which the yard brought from keel laying to launch in 45.5 days, a record that required running 3 shifts continuously and coordinating thousands of workers without a pause. The men who built that ship were not working at a comfortable industrial pace. They were racing. On April 16, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson personally asked Schwab to take over leadership of the Emergency Fleet Corporation, the government body charged with coordinating all American shipbuilding for the war effort. The EFC had been struggling. Shipbuilders operating under its direction were falling badly behind the demand for cargo and troop transport vessels, partly because the cost-plus contracting system the government had put in place rewarded delay rather than efficiency. Schwab accepted the appointment on one condition: he would replace cost-plus contracts with fixed-price agreements, eliminating the financial incentive for slow production. The change worked immediately. Shipbuilding output accelerated sharply in the months before the armistice, and Schwab received significant credit for the improvement. In the years after the war, Bethlehem and Schwab were labeled merchants of death by critics who argued that the company had made obscene profits from the suffering of the conflict, particularly during the years when America was technically neutral and Bethlehem was supplying all sides. Congressional investigations followed. the charges were ultimately rejected by the courts. What the investigations could not dispute was the underlying fact. Bethlehem had made an enormous amount of money from the war, and that money had funded expansions in capacity, workforce, and equipment that set the company up for the even greater production challenges that lay ahead. When the armistice came in November of 1918, Charles Schwab was the most celebrated industrialist in America. Back in Bethlehem, Eugene Grace, who had been managing the company's operations with increasing autonomy throughout the war years, was already building the internal systems that would define Bethlehem's next 3 decades. The ship was not the only thing Bethlehem was building during this period. In January of 1908, the White Company had begun producing something that would transform the American cityscape more thoroughly than any single industrial product had ever done before. The wide-flange structural steel shape, manufactured through a rolling process that the company's engineers had adapted from a patent held by a man named Henry Gray, was architecturally unglamorous. It was an eye-shaped beam of steel, thicker on the horizontal flanges than the older Carnegie-style beam designs, capable of bearing vertical loads that would have required significantly heavier and more expensive traditional beams to support. What it made possible was not just taller buildings. It made possible a fundamentally different approach to construction. The steel skeleton frame, in which the load-bearing structure of a building was a web of standardized, mass-produced steel members that could be designed in an office and assembled on a site in weeks rather than months. The first major project using Bethlehem's gray beams was the Gimbel's department store in New York City, which consumed 12,000 tons of the new product. After Gimbel's, the orders never stopped. The Chrysler Building used Bethlehem Steel. The Empire State Building used Bethlehem Steel. So did Rockefeller Center and the Hoover Dam and Madison Square Garden and the prison on Alcatraz Island and the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. The Golden Gate Bridge used 68,000 tons of Bethlehem steel in its main structure, and Bethlehem supplied the cables of the George Washington Bridge and the deck structure of the Ben Franklin Bridge in Philadelphia. By 1940, approximately 80% of the New York City skyline was supported by products made in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania and at Sparrows Point, Maryland. That figure, 80%, deserves to be understood not as a marketing claim, but as a structural fact about the American-built environment. When you look at a photograph of New York City taken at any point between the 1920s and the 1980s, you are looking at the work of Bethlehem Steel. Eugene Grace became president of the company in 1916 at age 39, the same age at which Schwab had assumed the presidency of Carnegie Steel. Schwab remained as chairman, the public voice and strategic visionary, traveling and entertaining and representing the company's ambitions to the outside world. Grace ran the operations with a precision and an authority that his workforce found simultaneously impressive and suffocating. His arrival at the office each morning was a choreographed event. 2 Bethlehem Steel police officers stationed themselves to watch for his chauffeured car. When it was spotted, a signal went to the office building. Every elevator in the building was halted at the nearest floor and its occupants removed. All elevators then dropped to the lobby level. When Grace entered the building, he would select his elevator and rise to his floor, in complete isolation. This happened every working day. Everyone in the building understood what it meant about the nature of authority in this organization, and they conducted themselves accordingly. His approach to organized labor was direct and unchanged for decades. He had supported the anti-union open shop movement throughout the 1920s. When Labor Secretary Francis Perkins convened a conference in 1933 that included union leadership, Grace walked out. He explained later that the company had maintained what he described as an almost sacred policy against recognizing organized labor. When the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935 and legally compelled all American companies to recognize workers' right to organize, Grace continued to resist. It took a strike in March of 1941. With defense contracts hanging in the balance on the eve of the country's entry into the Second World War, to finally compel Bethlehem to allow its workers to form a legitimate union. The riots that accompanied that strike lasted 4 days and required the Pennsylvania governor to declare a state of emergency before Grace accepted the settlement. Through all of this, Charles Schwab's personal finances were collapsing. The Depression had arrived in 1929. and the fortune estimated at $200 million at its peak could not survive years of lavish spending combined with investment losses of the magnitude the crash produced. The taxes on the Riverside Drive mansion became unpayable. Schwab tried to sell the property for $4 million and found no buyers. He offered it to the city of New York as the official mayor's residence. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia turned the offer down, reportedly saying he could not imagine himself in such a place. The mansion that Andrew Carnegie had said made his own home look like a shack stood empty, its gardens going to seed, its organ silent. Schwab died on September 18, 1939, in a small apartment on Park Avenue, more than $300,000 in debt. He was 77 years old. The mansion was eventually demolished in 1948 and replaced with a plain brick apartment complex that still occupies that block of Riverside Drive today and still carries his name. Had he lived 3 more years, he would have seen the company he had built receive wartime orders that would have restored his entire fortune many times over. He did not live 3 more years, and the restoration came too late to reach him. When Charles Schwab died in September of 1939, the war that would define his company's greatest hour had already begun. Eugene Grace, who was playing golf at the Socon Valley Country Club when word came of the outbreak in Europe, told his fellow executives that they were about to make a great deal of money. He was not wrong about the short term. He was catastrophically wrong about what it meant for the long term, though neither he nor anyone else in that moment could see why. Within weeks of the European outbreak, Bethlehem Steel had already received orders exceeding $1.3 billion for ammunition, armor plate, and warships. Grace drove the company's production to 101% of its rated normal capacity from 1941 through 1944, a performance that required every facility to run 3 shifts around the clock without interruption. In 1943, he made a personal promise to President Franklin Roosevelt that Bethlehem would deliver 1 new ship every single day of the year. He exceeded that commitment by 15 vessels, producing 380 ships in that single year. Across Bethlehem's 15 active shipyards during the full span of the war, the total output reached more than 1,100 ships. The range of vessel types is itself remarkable. Essex-class aircraft carriers, Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, Cleveland-class light cruisers, Fletcher-class destroyers, Gearing-class destroyers, destroyer escorts, battleships, submarines, landing craft, tankers, cargo ships, Liberty ships, Victory ships, ocean-going tugboats. The 15 yards employed 180,000 workers in shipbuilding operations alone. The full company workforce reached 300,000 people at wartime peak, a number larger than the population of many American cities. From 1941 through 1945, Bethlehem produced 73 million tons of steel, representing nearly 1/3 of all armor plate and gun forgings used by the United States in the entire war. Nearly 3/4 of all airplane engine cylinders manufactured in America came from Bethlehem facilities. Gross sales that had stood at $135 million before the war climbed to $1.33 billion by its end. At Fore River in Quincy, the wartime record was extraordinary. The yard surpassed every other American shipbuilding facility in total tonnage delivered. It built 4 Essex-class aircraft carriers, 7 light cruisers, 7 heavy cruisers, and the battleship USS Massachusetts, among dozens of other vessels. At peak production, 32,000 workers reported to the Quincy Yard each day, including 1,200 women who worked as welders, crane operators, sheet metal workers, electricians, and supervisors. Many of these women had never worked in heavy industry before the war. By the time the war ended, they were running some of the most technically complex operations in the yard. The company dismissed them in the months after victory and returned their positions to the men who came home from the front. At the Bethlehem Fairfield Yard in Baltimore, built specifically for the emergency shipbuilding program, 384 Liberty ships were produced during the war years. The very first of these vessels, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched at that yard on December 30th, 1941. Less than a month after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Liberty ship itself was one of the engineering achievements of the war, a standardized cargo design built from prefabricated sections using electric welding rather than traditional riveting, which cut construction time from months to weeks and allowed the ships to be produced faster than German submarines could sink them. The production numbers attached to Bethlehem's wartime contribution require a moment to absorb fully, because they represent something beyond ordinary industrial achievement. One historian later wrote that Bethlehem was the most important company to America's national defense of any company in the past century, and that without it, the Allies could not have won either World War. Whether that assessment is precisely correct is a matter for historians to debate. What is beyond debate is this: in the autumn of 1945, Bethlehem Steel stood at the absolute summit of its power and its reputation, and buried inside the decisions of those triumphant years were the mechanisms of its eventual destruction. When the soldiers came home in 1945, they came home to a country that needed everything at once: bridges and buildings and highways and houses and consumer goods and ships to carry them. The American economy had been retooled for war production and was now retooling again for the greatest peacetime expansion in the country's history, and almost all of it required steel. Bethlehem's production capacity grew from 13 million tons in 1945 to 23 million tons by the mid-1950s. By 1957, the Sparrows Point complex had become the largest single steel plant in the world, a 5-square-mile industrial city on the Patapsco River waterfront, employing 30,000 workers at the mill and 4,000 more at the adjacent shipyard. The complex had its own rail network, its own power generation, its own police force, its own fire department, its blast furnaces, each producing between 2,600 and 3,000 tons of iron per day, ran continuously through every season. The light from the furnace taps at night was visible for miles across the bay. The Bethlehem, Pennsylvania plant operated on a similar scale of community integration. The company employed 24,000 workers at that facility alone. It maintained more police officers than the city of Bethlehem itself. It paved the streets of the surrounding neighborhoods, plowed snow in winter, and it helped build the municipal water system that the city depended on. The economic life of the Lehigh Valley, which included businesses, schools, churches, and every category of local commerce, organized itself around the rhythms of the steel plant, the way that earlier communities had organized themselves around rivers or ports. When the furnaces ran at full capacity, the valley prospered. When they slowed, the whole community could feel it in the shops and the restaurants and the waiting rooms of the doctors and dentists who served steelworker families. In 1958, Business Week published its annual ranking of the highest compensated business executives in America. The top position went to Arthur Homer, the president of Bethlehem Steel, who had earned $511,000 in total compensation for the year. 7 of the 10 names on the entire list worked for Bethlehem Steel. One former member of the company's legal staff, reflecting on that era years later, said that Bethlehem at the time had the reputation that its hallways were lined with gold, and that when you were hired, they gave you a pick to mine it. It was not a comment made with irony. It was a memory of how it actually felt to work for one of the most profitable corporations in America during the most prosperous decade the country had ever known. For the workers on the mill floors and in the shipyards, the post-war decades were the closest thing to economic security that industrial labor had experienced in American history. Union contracts negotiated through the United Steelworkers guaranteed wages, health care, and pensions. Workers bought homes in the communities surrounding the plants. Their children went to college on steelworker wages, the broad middle class that defined post-war American life, which seemed not just durable but permanent, was built in significant part on the wages paid in those plants and those yards. None of it felt fragile from the inside. That was the problem. Eugene Grace retired from Bethlehem Steel in 1957, a man honored by almost everyone who had worked under him. What his admirers had not yet understood was that the decisions he had made during the most profitable years in the company's history had quietly placed a time bomb inside the balance sheet, and that the timer was already running. The first and most consequential failure was the pension problem. During the peak years of the late 1940s and the 1950s, when the company was generating profits that seemed inexhaustible, Grace had failed to make the pension fund contributions that the company's obligations to its workers required. The actuarial math was not complicated. If you are promising pensions to a large workforce, you must set aside money while that workforce is young and productive to fund the payments you will owe when they are old and retired. Grace did not fully do this. The contributions that should have been made during the years of greatest profitability were not made. At the time, with a young growing workforce and far more active employees than retirees, the shortfall was invisible. As the workforce aged and the ratio of retirees to active workers shifted, the underfunded obligations would become a weight the company could not lift. The second failure was technological. Bethlehem had built its production capacity around the open hearth furnace, the steel-making method that had served the industry for decades. By the 1950s, a superior method, the basic oxygen furnace, was available. It was faster, cheaper, and more energy efficient. The installation cost for basic oxygen capacity ran approximately $17 per ton. The open hearth method cost approximately $35 per ton. A company with no existing investment in open hearth furnaces would have chosen basic oxygen without hesitation. Bethlehem had enormous existing investment in open hearth equipment, and the depreciation schedules on that equipment argued against writing it off prematurely. The company committed to protecting its existing assets rather than adopting the better technology. The first Bethlehem basic oxygen furnace did not go into operation until 1964 at Sparrows Point, a full decade after the superiority of the process had been demonstrated. The continuous casting story was even more painful, because in this case, Bethlehem had not merely delayed adoption. It had developed the technology and then abandoned it. In the 1960s, the company ran 2 separate pilot plant experiments in continuous casting, a process that eliminated several expensive intermediate steps by taking molten steel and casting it directly into usable semi-finished shapes rather than pouring it into ingot molds and then reheating and rolling those ingots. Both pilot plants were shut down on the grounds that they were not high production units and therefore not cost-effective to scale to commercial volume. The decision was defensible in the narrow terms in which it was made. In broader terms, it was catastrophic. The Japanese steel industry, which had been watching American technical development with careful attention throughout this period, absorbed the findings from Bethlehem's own published research and from details that circulated at international technical conferences. Japanese steelmakers, rebuilding their industry from essentially nothing after the war, had no legacy open hearth investment to protect. They adopted basic oxygen furnaces from the beginning and then built continuous casting into their new facilities as the technology reached commercial maturity. The process that Bethlehem had proved was technically viable and then walked away from became the foundation of the cost advantage that would eventually make Japanese steel cheaper than domestic production. Bethlehem's research and development spending through the 1970s remained below 0.6% of net sales. For a company whose entire competitive position rested on its ability to produce steel at scale, this was not a minor accounting detail. It was a measurement of institutional complacency. Eugene Grace had also built a culture, and the culture he built was one of hierarchy so steep in certainty, so deep that it was structurally resistant to outside information. He had trained generations of executives to understand that there was one correct way to make steel, and that was Bethlehem's way. He refused to groom a successor and ran the company's decision-making through his own authority until he was no longer physically present to exercise it. When he retired, he left behind an organization that had internalized his convictions as organizational doctrine rather than examining them as strategic choices that might need revision. The 1959 steel strike exposed the consequences of this rigidity. For 116 days, members of the United Steel Workers of America refused to work, halting over 85% of domestic steel production. American manufacturers who depended on steel for their operations were forced to find alternative sources. They found them in Japan, in Germany, in Belgium, in countries where the reconstructed steel industries could offer comparable products at lower prices. Imports into the United States jumped from 2 million tons in 1958 to 5 million tons in 1959. Many of the customers who went to foreign suppliers during those 4 months never came back. One Bethlehem manager who watched the transition happening described losing market in small increments. Nails, field fence, barbed wire, each loss seemingly minor, until the cumulative damage to the cost structure became impossible to overlook. Belgian barbed wire, he noted, was arriving at Baltimore docks at prices below what Bethlehem could manufacture the same product for in Pennsylvania. The mini-mill threat developed on a similar trajectory. Small electric arc furnaces that melted scrap steel into basic products were entering the market throughout the 1960s with individual capacities of 60,000 tons per year or less. A senior Bethlehem metallurgical engineer who was specifically assigned to monitor these operations reported to management at regular intervals on their growth. The response he consistently received, as he later recalled, was that any individual mini-mill was too small to matter. The logic was accurate about each individual facility. It was completely wrong about the trend. One mini-mill was not a threat. Dozens of them serving the same regional markets and taking the same product categories were a structural transformation that Bethlehem was watching but not understanding. The countries whose steel industries Bethlehem had helped destroy during the Second World War rebuilt those industries with the technologies that Bethlehem had invented, tested, and set aside. Japan had started from essentially nothing after 1945. Its old steel plants had been bombed into rubble. When Reconstruction began, the Japanese steel industry had no legacy investments in open-hearth furnaces to protect, no sunk costs arguing for continuity with the old methods. They built basic oxygen furnaces. They adopted continuous casting as a standard process. They trained workforces to produce steel at quality levels that matched or exceeded American output, while paying wages that, by 1978, averaged $10.42 per hour compared to $14.73 in the American steel industry. The gap was not standing still. Every contract cycle in the United States steel industry pushed wages higher, while Japanese and later Korean and Chinese wages rose more slowly relative to productivity gains. By the late 1960s, imports from Japanese and European mills were arriving at American ports at prices as much as 20% below what domestic producers charged. South Korean producers entered the market through the 1980s, and Chinese production capacity began its expansion in the same decade. The mini-mills that had been dismissed through the 1960s were by the 1970s cutting seriously into Bethlehem's structural steel and plate markets, the product categories that had historically been protected by the capital requirements of large-scale integrated production. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 hit construction and automotive demand simultaneously, shrinking the overall market precisely when foreign competition was expanding its share of it. The double pressure of contracting demand and lower-cost competition squeezed Bethlehem from both directions at once. What made the combination particularly devastating was the fixed-cost structure of integrated steelmaking at Bethlehem scale. Those enormous plants at Sparrows Point and in Bethlehem, and at Lackawanna in New York, and at Johnstown in Pennsylvania required high production volumes to justify their operating expenses. The blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the coke ovens, the maintenance staffs, the pension payments, the healthcare obligations. None of these costs could be reduced proportionally when demand fell. A plant running at 90% of capacity could be profitable. The same plant at 60% of capacity was losing money every single day the furnaces ran, and you could not simply turn a blast furnace off. Stopping and restarting them cost millions of dollars and months of lost production. The company's options when demand fell were limited: run and lose money at high volume, or shut down and lose even more money on the restart. There was no comfortable middle position. In 1982, the accumulated weight of these pressures became publicly undeniable. Bethlehem posted a loss of $1.5 billion, the largest in the company's history up to that point, and suspended most of its steelmaking operations. The communities built around the closed facilities in Lackawanna and Johnstown and across the industrial Midwest experienced what economists would describe as deindustrialization, but which the people living through it experienced simply as the end of the world they had known. Plants closed without warning, thousands of jobs disappeared, tax bases evaporated, populations began to fall. The Rust Belt, which had been an abstraction in the 1970s, became a geographic reality that reshaped the political and social landscape of the country. Bethlehem returned to brief profitability in 1988, and the restructuring seemed for a moment to be working. Then the 1990s arrived and brought the final accounting. One by one through the early years of that decade, the parts of Bethlehem Steel that could not be saved were removed. The coal mining operations run under the name Beth Energy were discontinued in 1991. The Railroad Car Manufacturing Division, which had operated since the company acquired Midvale Steel and Ordnance in 1923, and which had made Bethlehem one of the world's leading producers of freight cars for nearly 70 years, was sold through a management buyout in 1991 and became Johnstown America Industries. The Johnstown steel plants, which had been in continuous operation since the 1850s, closed permanently in 1992. The company exited the railroad car business entirely in 1993. Each of these closures reduced the workforce and therefore the revenue base, while doing nothing to reduce the obligations owed to the workers who had already retired. The arithmetic was becoming impossible. By 2001, Bethlehem employed 13,000 workers nationwide, down from a wartime peak of 300,000. The company was paying those 13,000 active employees to generate profits sufficient to fund the pensions and health care of 74,400 retirees and the health care of approximately 130,000 additional dependents and former employees. The ratio of active workers to beneficiaries had inverted completely from the 1940s when Grace had declined to fully fund the pension plans. The bill he had deferred was now due in full. On November 18, 1995, the last steel was poured at the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania plant. The closing ceremony played God Bless America over loudspeakers on the mill floor. Workers who had spent their entire careers in those buildings walked out knowing they would never walk back in. One man who had worked there since the early 1960s said later that he had never in his life believed the plant would close, and that even at the very end he had expected something to happen that would prevent it. Nothing happened. 132 years of continuous steel production at the birthplace of the company ended on a November afternoon in the Lehigh Valley with a song and a silence. The shipbuilding had already been surrendered. In 1997, Bethlehem sold the Sparrows Point Shipyard to Baltimore Marine Industries, ending 108 years of Bethlehem involvement in the business that had once made it the most important defense contractor in American history. Baltimore Marine Industries would itself collapse in bankruptcy in 2003, and the yard passed through 4 more owners before arriving at its current incarnation as a logistics terminal. The Fore River Yard in Quincy had been sold decades earlier. Bethlehem put it on the market in the early 1960s when it could no longer justify the operating costs, and General Dynamics purchased it in 1964 for $5 million. General Dynamics invested heavily in the facility, installing a 1,200-ton lifting crane called Goliath, one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere, and spent years building liquefied natural gas tankers and naval support vessels. When the contracts stopped coming in the mid-1980s, there was nothing left to justify the operating costs, and the yard that had produced more warship tonnage than any other American facility during the Second World War closed permanently in 1986. The site was eventually redeveloped. Today it holds a naval museum anchored by the heavy cruiser USS Salem, one of the ships built at the yard during the war years, floating at the same dock where she was launched, accessible to anyone who wants to walk her decks. Bethlehem Steel Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on October 15, 2001. The filing came just weeks after the September 11th attacks, which CEO Robert Miller said had turned what was already a declining marketplace into a free fall. The company was the 25th American steelmaking firm to file for bankruptcy in just 4 years, from 1998 through 2001. The domestic steel industry was not suffering isolated failures. It was in systemic collapse. Labor costs at Sparrows Point, by the time of the filing, stood at approximately $100 per ton of steel produced. Foreign competitors were paying between $20 and $30. The pension fund held $5.7 billion in assets, but was obligated to tens of thousands of retirees. The healthcare obligations extended to approximately 130,000 people. There was no path to solvency that did not require eliminating obligations the company could not legally eliminate. On May 7, 2003, the remaining assets of Bethlehem Steel Corporation were sold to International Steel Group for approximately $752 million in cash plus additional consideration. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private pension plans, assumed Bethlehem's pension obligations in the largest such assumption in the history of that program. In 2005, International Steel Group was acquired by Middle Steel. In 2006, Middle merged with Arcelor to form ArcelorMittal, which became one of the largest steel companies in the world. American ownership of what Bethlehem Steel had spent a century building was gone. And then the question became, what do you do with a place that size? In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the 5 blast furnaces that once produced between 2,600 and 3,000 tons of iron every single day were not torn down. The decision not to demolish them was not inevitable. The 1,800-acre brownfield along the Lehigh River was contaminated by more than a century of industrial operations, economically dormant and a visible daily reminder of loss to every resident who drove past it. The city could have chosen erasure and begun again on clean ground. Civic leaders who traveled to Germany's Ruhr Valley in the years after the plant closed found a different model. Former industrial sites in the Ruhr had been transformed into cultural destinations, their furnaces and coking towers preserved as monuments and repurposed as venues, their contaminated land remediated and given new uses that honored the industrial history, while creating economic activity for communities that had suffered through deindustrialization as severely as any in Europe. The model was applicable. A coalition of local organizations led by a nonprofit arts group called ArtsQuest, working with the Bethlehem Redevelopment Authority and supported by state and federal grants and private donors, developed a plan for the former mill site on the south bank of the Lehigh. The result was Steel Stacks, a 9.5-acre arts and cultural campus built around the preserved furnaces, funded through a combination of public and private sources totaling approximately $120 million. The campus opened in May of 2011 and now draws 1.5 million visitors per year. The 5 furnaces, which stretch nearly a quarter-mile along the riverfront, are lit at night and visible from across the Lehigh Valley. The tallest of them rises more than 200 feet, visible from the highway that passes through town and from the hills that surround the valley. The campus holds the ArtsQuest Center with its performance stages and the Frank Banco Alehouse cinemas, the Levitt Pavilion Outdoor Amphitheater where 50 free concerts are held each summer, a PBS Public Broadcasting Center, and a visitor center housed in the restored historic Stockhouse building. The elevated Hoover Mason trestle, which required $10 million to refurbish, runs along the base of the furnaces and allows visitors to walk the length of the structure at close range, reading the history of the plant on interpretive panels mounted at each point. Music Fest, held annually on the Steel Stacks grounds, has become one of the largest free music festivals in the country. The National Museum of Industrial History, a Smithsonian affiliate housed in the former electric repair shop of the Bethlehem plant, opened in August of 2017 after a long and difficult development process that included management failures, a grand jury review, and a period of institutional uncertainty about whether the museum would open at all. It eventually did, and it now holds objects, documents, and artifacts from Bethlehem's 140 years of operation, telling the story of American industrialization in the physical space where that industrialization was concentrated. The irony embedded in the Steel Stacks development is worth holding for a moment. The model for transforming an abandoned American steel site into a viable cultural destination came from Germany, the country whose steel industry Bethlehem Steel had helped destroy during the Second World War, whose plants had been rebuilt with the modern technologies that eventually outcompeted Bethlehem's own, provided the template for what to do with what Bethlehem left behind. The student had become the teacher, then the competitor, then, in this particular way, the model. At Sparrows Point, the answer to the same question was different and perhaps more honest about what the economy of the 21st century actually requires. TradePoint Atlantic, the 3,300-acre successor to the former steel and shipyard complex, functions as a logistics hub. Amazon and Under Armour and Home Depot and Volkswagen and McCormick and Company have major distribution and fulfillment operations on land, where the dry docks once held destroyers and the slipways launched ships. The deepwater port access that made Sparrows Point valuable for shipbuilding now serves container vessels carrying goods assembled in countries whose industrial workforce costs a fraction of what American workers earn. In March of 2024, a container ship struck the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore and brought it down into the Patapsco River. The debris blocked the main shipping channel for months. TradePoint Atlantic designated 5 formerly unused acres of its property as a processing center for the scrap steel from the bridge. The steel from a bridge that had crossed the river near where Bethlehem's ships had been launched was processed on the land that Bethlehem Steel had once occupied. History does not always close its circles neatly. This one came close. Bethlehem Steel is not a cautionary tale about greed, though there was greed. It is not a story about unions destroying a great company, though labor costs were genuinely important. It is not simply a story about foreign competition, though foreign competition was real and ultimately decisive. It is a story about something more fundamental. The way that extraordinary success can make an organization incapable of responding to change, precisely because the organization's entire identity is built on the conditions that produced the success. The same qualities that made Bethlehem invincible at its peak, its enormous scale, its vertical integration, its deeply embedded certainty about how steel should be made and who should make the decisions about it, became the mechanism of its collapse when the conditions changed. The open hearth furnaces in which the company had invested over decades could not be written off without destroying the capital structure that supported everything else. The pension obligations that should have been funded during the prosperous years became unpayable when the workforce shrank and the profits disappeared. The culture that Grace had built, hierarchical and proud and certain that external challenges were temporary annoyances rather than structural threats, could not generate the kind of adaptive response that might have extended the company's life. The continuous casting story captures this pattern in the most compressed form. Bethlehem developed the technology. Bethlehem tested it. Bethlehem abandoned it. The Japanese absorbed the findings from Bethlehem's own publications and built their entire reconstructed industry on the process that Bethlehem had validated and then walked away from. The technology came back to destroy the company that had invented its commercial viability. Industrial history does not offer second chances to the organizations that miss their moment, and it does not wait for them to be ready. The workers who bore the costs of these decisions deserve to be named as precisely as the executives who made them. More than 74,000 retirees lost some or all of their anticipated pension benefits when the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation assumed Bethlehem's obligations in 2002. Approximately 130,000 people had been counting on company-funded health care. A worker who began on the Bethlehem plant floor in 1963 and retired in 1990 could look at the Golden Gate Bridge and the Chrysler Building and the Navy vessels in museums along the East Coast and say, with complete accuracy, "I made those." Then watch the company dissolve, the pension shrink, and the plant become a casino and an arts campus. The transformation of those sites is genuinely something rather than nothing. 1.5 million visitors come to Steel Stacks each year. The National Museum of Industrial History preserves the record of what was built and how. TradePoint Atlantic employs people and generates economic activity on the same waterfront where the shipyard workers once clocked in for the morning shift. The communities that organize their identities around steel have shown varying degrees of resilience in the decades since the furnaces went cold. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which began diversifying its economy as early as the 1960s, has fared considerably better than many Rust Belt cities. The harder cases remain hard. If this is the kind of history you want to keep watching, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It makes a genuine difference to our ability to continue making these documentaries, and we read every single comment. Thank you for watching to the end of this one. The 5 blast furnaces at Steel Stacks are lit at night, and if you drive through Bethlehem after dark, you can see them glowing above the Lehigh River, the only fire they still carry. The Fore River Yard in Quincy is a waterfront development now, with the USS Salem floating at the dock where her keel was laid, her decks open to anyone who wants to walk them and stand at the rail and look out at the water where the warships she served alongside once passed. At Sparrows Point, the Amazon warehouse receives packages from around the world on a waterfront where American workers once built the ships that carried the century to its outcome. What Bethlehem Steel built does not require the company's name on it to stand. The bridges are still there. The buildings are still there. Some of the ships are still there in memorial parks and naval museums where you can climb the ladders and walk the passageways and look down through the portholes at the water below and think about the 300,000 people who made them, who worked the furnaces and operated the cranes and drove the rivet guns and ran the welding torches in the yards at Sparrows Point and Quincy and Baltimore and San Francisco, who never saw the ships they built enter the harbors of cities they liberated. They only made the steel that made the ships that made the world safe enough for someone else to sail home.